I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists. Naming something doesn't mean that we get it. So
welcome to Wonderfest, presenting Ask a Science Envoy. Yes, it's biodiversity and cosmic maps tonight. My name is Tucker Hyatt. I'm the founding director of Wonderfest, the Bay Area beacon of science. And even for you old timers, you true wonder-nuts, I want to tell you just a bit about Wonderfest. It semi-brags about being the world's smallest nonprofit. It has a 4-point nonprofit mission statement: to inspire curiosity, to promote careful reasoning, to challenge unexamined beliefs, and to encourage lifelong learning. If you'd like to see how Wonderfest brings those rather lofty ideals down to earth, please visit us online at wonderfest.org, O-R-G. All right, before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to introduce a co-producer, a collaborator in this production, and that is the Berkeley Public Library, as represented by Sierra Campagna. Sierra, will you say a few words, please?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tucker. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for partnering with us at the Berkeley Public Library. We are doing a lot of in-person events now, but we're still doing quite a few virtual events. So I just wanted to do a quick plug for a couple things coming up virtually, if anyone is interested. We have resume writing workshops that are virtual that you can join. One is actually happening tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. And then we have a series of workshops coming up in April. Cafe Ohlone Talks, which is a cafe in Berkeley, and they're going to be talking about all sorts of things in these 4 discussions, including, I'm looking at my notes here, things related to language, community, and culinary traditions. So anyway, thank you so much for including Berkeley Public Library in your talks. Big fan of Wonderfest, and I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you, thank you. Here comes our first speaker, paleobiologist and ecologist, Dr. Maria Viteri, on exhuming the dead to save the living. Maria earned her undergrad degree in biological sciences at the University of Chicago, and she just completed her PhD program at Stanford, working in the biodiversity lab of Professor Elizabeth Hadley, herself a Wonderfest speaker some 15 years ago. I'm delighted to say that Maria has just earned a new position with the Nature Conservancy in San Francisco. Please welcome paleobiologist and, as far as the Nature Conservancy says, ecologist, and I hope forever local, Wonderfest Science Envoy, Dr. Maria Viteri.
Thank you, Tucker. That was a very nice introduction. Yeah, I'm right now a postdoctoral researcher at Stanford, about to start a position with the Nature Conservancy, and today I'm going to be talking about conservation paleobiology, and the title of the talk is Exhuming the Dead to Save the Living. So, as many of you probably know, we are currently in a biodiversity crisis. We are losing species and habitats really, really quickly, just hemorrhaging species. And this is called the Anthropocene. Here I'm kind of defining the Anthropocene as being 1950 to present. That's very up for debate. It depends on who you ask. So this biodiversity crisis has been driven by all these, a variety of human factors, such as climate change, pollution, input of toxins into systems. There's direct culling via hunting, and a huge one, and what I'm mostly going to be talking about today, is the modification of landscapes, the destruction of habitat, conversion of landscapes for human use. So just kind of an example of this, this is from Google Earth. They're doing these really cool time lapses where you can see from the 1980s to present how much forests in this particular case we've lost to human land use change, modifying our systems for human use, such as agriculture and etc. Yeah, you can see that difference there is pretty startling. And that's not just happening in Bolivia, this is happening all around the world, just an example. So we're losing a lot of habitat, leading to a lot of biodiversity loss, right? Okay, but I mean, that was just going back to 1984. That's not that long ago. Really, to know the true extent and magnitude of human impacts on this planet, we need to go deeper. We need to go further into the past, right? So luckily, historical and fossil records can provide this window into the past. So today, what I'm talking about is conservation paleobiology, and this is the subdiscipline that I'm a part of, which applies data from past ecosystems to inform the conservation of present ones. And it does so in a couple of ways. The first thing that it can do is it can establish baselines for looking towards the past to understand how our present animal communities, plant communities, etc., have changed over the last few thousand years, for example. And so from that, we can understand how we might conserve those species. The other thing you could do, you could look further into the past. And this is kind of a jargony phrase, but you can understand the components of functional ecosystems and disturbance response in analogous systems or time periods in the past. What that means is maybe if we're interested in how animals respond to climate change today and how they're going to respond to climate change in the future, we might look at periods in the fossil record where we knew that climate change was happening. So for example, in the Miocene, there was a time period that things got really, really warm. And we can look at how the animal communities responded to that period of intense global change, right? And use that to understand what's going to happen in the future. And today, mostly I'm going to be talking about this more recent fossil record, historical records, and how they can be useful in conservation. But this is a very, very interesting part of conservation paleobiology that I wanted to mention. So there are a variety of data sources that we can use. So I might have been thinking mostly of the archaeological and paleontological material, the fossils, but there are other really cool places where we might get kind of repository of past information. So we might look at museums, might look at sediment cores, which I'll describe. I'm going to describe all of these things in further detail in a second. Tree rings, this is called dendrochronology, and also kind of written historical records. So just going to give like an example of each one of these, because I think they're all really cool. Museums are a really cool place to get information about how things have changed over time. And here's just a really cool study that I found that shows an example of how powerful these collections can be. So these are birds from a museum collection, and
my computer.
And the ones that you can see that are kind of darker in color, that's soot. That's carbon particles on their feathers. And what this is they're looking at birds from the same species that were collected at a time prior to environmental policies that regulated the input of carbon into the atmosphere. And then birds after that environmental policy was put into place. So you can actually see the effects of this policy on animals through these museum collections. And that's a really cool thing. Another thing you can look at is sediment cores. Sediment, if you're not familiar with sediment cores, what they are, you basically take a tube, like a PVC pipe, and you drive it down into a lake, the sediment in a lake or another body of water. You pull it back up and you get these kind of banded layers of sediment, with the bottom being kind of older than the record and the top being younger, more recent, right? And so you can kind of look over time and see what's going on. And there's a few things that you can find, and there's a wealth of information in these sediment cores. You can get things like pollutants, toxins, all sorts of different chemicals. You can look at little microfossils like diatoms, for example, and see how the biota are changing over time. The animal communities are changing. You might also look at the pollen or spore record to see how vegetation is changing over time. You can get charcoal, and so you can see differences in fire patterns. So maybe fires were more frequent in the past. And so fire suppression today is actually not natural. You can learn things like that. You can even see earthquakes in the records, which is quite cool. For example, I was lucky enough to be a part of a coring team at Searsville Lake, which is in Jasper Ridge Biological Reserve. It's in the South Bay area. And this is what the core kind of looked like. This is a photo of the core. This is it CT scanned, and you can see that there's kind of bands of more dense and less dense layers. We actually found out that this core was super, super high resolution, giving us kind of yearly understanding, really, of what was happening in this record, in this watershed, which is quite cool. And the thing that I looked at were microcrustaceans called ostracods. They're crustaceans, so they're basically like crabs, shrimp, that sort of thing. They're like shrimp with shells, but very, very small. They're very, very cute. And their shells preserve in fossil records. And so from those shells, you can say, you can understand how environments were changing over time, over the 130 years that this record was building up, which is quite cool. Dendrochronology, tree rings, really cool sorts of information. You can get things like periods of drought. You can get fire frequency. So like, for example, here, if the rings are closer together, maybe they're lacking nutrients, lacking water, that might be a drought period. Look, that's fire scarring. You can see fire frequency in the record. It's a really cool record. Historical records are incredibly useful for understanding the past and how things have changed. For example, you've probably heard of the passenger pigeon. The passenger pigeon was once very abundant, is now totally extinct. And the only reason we know how abundant they used to be is because we have historical records of people saying that as flocks flew overhead, they would blot out the sky. The flocks were that massive. And that was a direct hunting. We hunted them to extinction. It's crazy. And also fisheries are a great example of how we might use historical records, because fisheries often keep really, really good records of the fish that are taken and how big they were and how massive they were. So you can see from historical records how much we've depleted fish in areas and how much smaller they are today than they were in the past. Here's a really cool example of how it's very important to be looking at these kind of longer scale historical records when estimating how much of a species we have lost, right? So there's two species in here. I'm missing it here. I think it's saying green turtle. And this is hawksbill turtle, where they looked at the estimated percent change if they just incorporated studies that looked back a couple of decades, right? And for one, it looks like they haven't really changed at all, or that much. For the hawksbill turtle, it looks like they've actually gotten better. They're in the positive here. They're doing better than they were doing. But if they incorporate studies and records that look back on longer term scales, on more like a century level scale, you can see that they've actually declined quite a bit from these historical baselines. And so you get a really different result based on where you're looking, like how far you're going back in the record. This says population change estimates are more negative when long-term and historical data are included. And this is something really important that we talk about a lot in conservation biology, paleobiology, called shifting baselines. So it depends what your baseline is for how much you think something has changed. And the way that this is often explained is like, if you asked your parents like how many whales did you used to see off of this coast, they would say like, oh, much more, probably double. You asked your grandparents, they're like, no, it's quadruple. But you go further and further back into the record, and you realize kind of the magnitude of change, and it just depends on where your baseline is. And of course, fossils, which is mostly what I want to talk to you about today. There's some really cool records of shells, which can tell us a bunch of things. You can get stuff from archaeological sites as well as paleontological sites. And that's actually me kind of rappelling down into a cave in Wyoming, hunting for Pleistocene fossils. That was a really fun trip. And so you can use fossils in a variety of ways for conservation paleobiology. And as an example, I just wanted to share a little bit of my dissertation research looking at small mammal communities in the Bay Area. So here's my study area. The South San Francisco, but this is the Bay Area, obviously. And I was looking here, South San Francisco Bay Area, zoom in a little bit. And I discussed earlier how much, just in the past few decades, urbanization and human land use change has really impacted our landscapes. And this is true both over kind of spatial gradients and temporal gradients. And I'm going to show you how this is also true especially here in the Bay Area. So you can see how there is a bit of an urbanization gradient here, right? So if you look over at Palo Alto, this area, this is all homes, businesses, etc. And then you go kind of more over to this side of the screen, and you have much more kind of continuous, more natural landscapes, right? But this gradient also exists in time. So going back to just 1950, beginning of the Anthropocene, you can see that a lot of these spaces that are pretty urban today are not so much in the past, right? And of course, if you go back even further, you don't have urbanization at all. And there are a bunch of species that used to be present in this area that are just not here anymore, such as Tule elk and the California grizzly, which is actually now extinct. And it's quite obvious when you no longer can see an animal on a landscape, especially these mega animals, these really big animals. But what I was really interested in is there must be changes also happening to the species that are still present, right? So rodents, small mammals, are really abundant still today, and none of them in this area have gone extinct, but presumably their community compositions, so the relative abundances of different small mammal species, presumably have changed in response to all these impacts that I've been talking about. So I was interested in how this urbanization, this land use modification has impacted small mammal communities in the San Francisco Bay Area over both space and time. So this was my getting into the methods. My modern record were owl pellets. Just maybe like a little show of hands, or like just you can put up the little hand thing on your Zoom thing. Who has dissected an owl pellet before? Yeah, we got one at least.
Sorry, dissected a what?
An owl pellet.
Oh, thanks.
You know, it's very common in like middle schools. I hear, like especially like 5th grade seems about the time. A lot of people have dissected owl pellets before. It's really fun. So those of you who haven't or don't know what these are, raptors generally, including owls, so birds of prey, they eat animals like small mammals, like bulls and mice and stuff, but they can't digest hair or bone. And so what they do is they regurgitate that in the form of a pellet. So it ends up looking like this. Kind of yucky. This is like a mass of hair and bones, but they are amazing repositories of information. And so what I did for the modern record is I dissected all these. This is a skull right here. It looks like this. This is a bull skull. counted up all the bones, and so I knew what small mammals we currently have in our landscapes. And then in the same areas, I had access to archaeological deposits, and I did the same thing. I pulled out the small mammal bones from the archaeological record to get kind of a past record as my baseline for understanding how things have changed over time. So here are my collection sites all together. These circles are my owl pellet collections, you can see. And then these are my 3 archaeological sites. You can see they're roughly along the same axis from urban to more natural settings. And I've been saying that this is a human modification or urbanization gradient this whole time, but you don't have to take my word for it. This is proof. This is a human modification map that was created by somebody else. I'm using it with their permission, where these kind of lighter, more yellow colors are more modified areas. So 1 is the most modified an area can be. So basically more urban in this case, but just basically modified from natural. These purples being more natural. And this actually perfectly kind of outlines Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve. This is all kind of fairly natural in here, right? Okay, so in summary, for my modern and my fossil record, I collected and identified thousands of bones for both. And here are my results. So this, I want to take a little poll about this. So we're looking here at species richness against our human modification score. So for as human modification increases, how do you think diversity might respond? Do you think that small mammal diversity, so like the number of species that are found in an area, do you think that the diversity will go up when urbanization increases, or do you think it will decrease with urbanization? As an area gets more urban, do you think that there will be more species or less species, basically? Less species? Yeah, that is exactly what I found. Yeah. So as small mammal diversity declines with increasing modification. And then mapping on top of this, my 3 archaeological sites, we can see that the species richness of all 3 of these sites in the past have consistently high diversity. How might you think if we put back on our present, or the raptor pellet information, how do you think that diversity, how do you think it will compare to our past record? Do you think there are more species now or fewer species now, or a mix of the two? So do you think today there's more diversity in small mammals, less diversity in small mammals, or maybe a kind of mix? Fewer small mammals? Yeah, it's that's what I guessed as well. And it is largely true, except for the less modified areas, the more natural areas, the Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve, they actually match the species richness of the fossil record, which is quite cool. However, our more modified areas, the more urban areas, really see a sharp decline in species richness. And this is largely driven by our human commensal and invasive species, such as Rattus rattus, this is the black rat, and Mus musculus, which is the house mouse. So these are species that really like hanging out around humans, and they can really dramatically alter our small mammal communities. But my main takeaway from this project was that small protected spaces like Jasper Ridge can partially protect native animal communities, and really this highlights their important role in urban conservation. So if we wanted to kind of have some like take away something from this message, you might be able to say you might be able to leverage these results to create new biological preserves in similar spaces, and take lessons from what these preserves are doing well in order to kind of maintain biodiversity. So I want to just give an overall summary before I take questions of what we've talked about. So conservation paleobiology can establish baselines for conservation efforts, allow us to understand how ecosystems and communities have changed in the past to better understand present and future change, and inform environmental policy and land management practices. Okay, with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Maria. Very nice. I think the Nature Conservancy is in for some good news when they witness your communication skills. Thank you for that talk.
Thank you, Tiger. Should I stop sharing?
Beg your pardon? No, well, no, it's fine. Keep that image up for a second and we'll see about questions. I've got one for you just as we wait for the inquisitiveness typical of Wondernauts to arise here. I'd like to ask about, and this is almost a philosophical question, but this idea of the Anthropocene is so powerful that this geologic era, which I guess is officially designated now, the Anthropocene, has it been done by?
It's not 100% official yet, is my understanding. It is largely accepted by different kind of scientific fields. It's like a very hotly debated concept, I will say, in my field. So geologists largely are pretty skeptical. Biologists largely like it, but there's a lot of debate back and forth. And then there's also big debate on when the start date should be. Here I said 1950, but some people say Industrial Revolution. There's quite a lot of debate over the Anthropocene, but my thought is that it is kind of a new geological time period.
Is there, your hard question's coming, but is there an organization, perhaps an international organization, will ultimately make this decision?
Yeah. So there's this Anthropocene Working Group, which is the one who made the tentative 1950 estimation. And actually, I encourage you to look up the paper that I briefly showed about the Jasperage core. That was the Searsville Reservoir core, and they talked about, I did the ostracods on that. One of the goals for that project was actually to try to create a geological geological record that shows, that marks the actual beginning date of the Anthropocene, because you need that in order to actually formalize it. And that paper, we suggest that I think is actually 1948 seems to geologically be the time when there seems to be a really significant shift in the record.
All right, thank you. And here comes the harder part of my question. Clearly, the Anthropocene is defined as a humanocentric, anthropocentric concept. Is there any sort of agreement among experts like you regarding what the carrying capacity is of the entire Earth for humanity, the global population? I guess it must depend heavily on what type of lives these 10 billion or so people are going to be living. But is there an established maximum, given reasonable assumptions about environmental degradation caused by humans, for the carrying capacity of the Earth?
Yeah, that's a really tricky question, right? So it depends a lot. There are estimates, right? But estimates were made like in the 1970s that we have dramatically overshot. And the reason that we've dramatically overshot those estimates is because of technological advancements. And I think there are a lot of people who really hope that future technological advancements will solve all of our problems. But kind of the issue with that is it's one thing to have a carrying capacity just for humans, and there's another thing to kind of coexist with the other organisms that are on the planet. And there's been a push recently. There was a little while ago a push for this half Earth concept, which was that half of the Earth should be for humans and half of the Earth should be for animals, which I think is a little bit too, it's splitting up humans away from nature a little bit too much. We are an essential part of nature. We can coexist, but kind of more tangibly, a lot of at the California level, at the state level, at the national level, and now at the international level, there's been a push for 30% by 2030. So protecting 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. So the idea is to not only have there is a carrying capacity for humans, but also we have to be coexisting with other organisms, you know? And then another part of your question was like, okay, well, there's a carrying capacity for one type of person, but what about a different type of person? And so there's a lot of the nuance of kind of setting like a cap on population is that it often ends up pointing blame at the global south, which is still a place where human populations are expanding. But if you actually think about it, I, as a person in the global north, take up a lot more resources than somebody, say, in sub-Saharan Africa or something. So it's actually more of a question of resource use than just one of population. And it's really tricky and it's hard to estimate.
I think I understand. Thank you. Okay, just one more question, if you don't mind. I wonder if you could tell us what you think you'll be doing with the Nature Conservancy.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the position. So I'm going to be the lead ecologist for a preserve that's kind of in southern central California. And what I'm hoping, the big thing that I'm really hoping to do is, number one, we're going to be establishing kind of like an ecological research program for that particular preserve. But what I'm really looking forward to is kind of working between the different Nature Conservancy preserves, because really what conservation needs to be doing now, we can't be just siloed into each kind of preserve and doing things alone. We need to be really working together and thinking about things beyond these very arbitrary boundaries, right? We should be thinking about connectivity of where species are going to move, and how to make sure that they get to the places they need to be. We need to be thinking about genetic diversity, making sure that the populations are genetically healthy, so that the species can have longevity, both on short and long timescales. And what I'm excited to bring as this kind of conservation paleo, having this conservation paleo background, is that there are kind of fossil deposits in that region. And I think what would be really cool is being able to look at the fossil record and use it to answer some of the open questions that we have at the preserve. Trying to think about maybe doing some reintroduction programs for specific animals that were there in the past that are not here today, and things like that. And that's what I'm really excited to work on.
Indeed. Is the Nature Conservancy's at least a principal job to privatize certain public lands to help protect them from development?
Yeah, so they protect lands, but also they are really invested in working lands, which I think is very important. Like I was saying, you can't just take people out of places and call it, wilderness. That's not really our view of conservation anymore. So working lands are places like ranch lands and things like that, where perhaps cattle are still grazing, and that actually might be a kind of a fundamental ecosystem service that is provided by cattle that maybe used to be provided by elk or bison or something like that. So thinking about ways that you can work with people and also protect biodiversity is kind of the way moving forward.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Dr. Viteri. All right. Our second Ask a Science Envoy speaker is UC Berkeley astronomer Tyler Cox, now presenting Creating the Largest Ever Maps of the Universe. Tyler earned his undergrad degrees, 2 bachelor's degrees, one in physics and one in astronomy, at Arizona State University. Now he's a third-year PhD student working with Professor Aaron Parsons at Cal, go Bears, using radio telescopes to study the formation and evolution of the first stars and galaxies in the universe. Please welcome astronomer and Wonderfest Science Envoy, Tyler Cox.
Great, thank you so much, Tucker. Yeah, so my name is Tyler. I'm a third-year graduate student in the astronomy department. Primarily what I do is something called observational astronomy or observational cosmology. And my particular focus is understanding how galaxies form and evolve over time. I'll talk a little bit about what galaxies are exactly, but we're quite interested in how these things form, since they hold the majority of the stars in the universe. So I'll talk about that. While it probably seems like our talks couldn't be more different, I think mine will actually have some similarities to Maria in the sense that we're examining the fossil record of galaxies, actually, using light. Yeah, stepping away from Earth, but still using a fossil record of sorts, I would say. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. My talk is mostly going to focus on talking about the technique. Primarily what we do when observing galaxies is use these large optical telescopes, but my focus is using radio telescopes. So I'll talk about that at the end in the experiment that I've been working on. Okay, so just to jump right in, as I mentioned, I'm primarily interested in galaxies. And if you don't know what a galaxy is, galaxies are just these large collections of stars, gas, and dust. They have many different shapes. Some are these kind of oblong football shape type things. Others are these disks, which have these grand spiral structure, kind of like this galaxy here. But really, there are a large variety of shapes and sizes of galaxies in the universe. And anywhere you look, you see galaxies. We see something like 2 trillion or so galaxies in the observable universe. And we know that they must have formed somehow. The issue is we don't actually know exactly where they came from and at what time they formed. We know that they are evolving over time. They're adding new stars, they're merging with other galaxies, and they're changing. But how they actually form and when exactly they formed is still something of a mystery. Before I dive too deep into and how exactly we understand the formation and evolution of these galaxies, I want to talk about the technique that actually allows us to understand these in the first place. And it's this kind of unique property about the speed of light, in that it is not infinitely fast, but it is extremely fast. How fast is it exactly? It's about 300 million meters per second. In units that we're probably more familiar with in America, it's 1 foot per nanosecond. So why this is interesting at all is because the speed of light is not infinitely fast. What that means is when you go out and you look at things in the universe, depending on how far away an object is, you're actually looking at it as it was sometime in the past. Now, these aren't things that we notice on everyday scales, and on our human experience, but you can actually, there is some delay whenever we think about like light reaching like our eyes from, say, our hands or something. So if you held out your hand, for instance, the average arm length is something like 2 feet. So the light that's hitting your hand and then reaching your eyes takes about 2 nanoseconds to get to us. So what that means is you're never actually seeing your hand or your body or anything else as it is in this precise moment, but as it was some time delay ago. So this might seem insignificant on, like I said, human scales, but as you start thinking about astronomical scales, the scales that are much, much larger than the scales that we deal with in everyday life, what that means is it turns the night sky into a time machine of sorts. So what that means is if you look at an object that's some distance away, there is some time delay between the light that left that object and the time it reached our eyes when we're doing these observations. And depending on how far away that object is, you can actually look back further in time and study objects as they were in the history of the universe. So we actually use light at different distances, objects at different distances, as a way to, I guess, uncover the fossil record in the history of some of the objects that we try to study. So just to put this in familiar terms, things that we're used to seeing, I guess, in our own night sky, the moon, which is the closest astronomical object to us, is at a distance of something like 300,000 kilometers per second. Given the speed of light, that works out to something like 1.5 light seconds, or it takes a beam of light 1.5 seconds to reach our eyes from the moon. Or if you had a really powerful laser pointer, you could point it at the moon. That beam of light would bounce off of the surface and reach back into your eyes in about the time it would take a single breath. So it's extremely fast, and the distances between us and the moon actually aren't that big. But as you go out further, these effects start to become more noticeable. For example, the nearest star system to us is called Alpha Centauri. It's about 40 trillion kilometers away. And that works out to a distance of something like 4 light years, meaning the distance or the time it takes a light beam to get from Alpha Centauri to us takes about 4 years or so. Moving on to galaxies, since that's kind of the focus of today's talk, the closest large galaxy to us is called the Andromeda Galaxy. It's something like 30 quintillion kilometers away, or 3 with 19 zeros behind it, kilometers away. And that is at a distance of about 2.5 million light years. And this is where things start to get kind of interesting, because the light that's leaving the stars that is being created in this galaxy takes about 2.5 million years to reach our eyes or reach our telescopes. So the light that we're just now observing to get an understanding of what's happening in the Andromeda Galaxy left its source around the time the first hominids were revolving on the Earth, which is kind of crazy to think about. Now, even given these distances, observing a galaxy whose light has been traveling for about 2.5 million years before reaching our telescopes is still relatively small in cosmological terms, meaning that galaxies actually don't evolve much over a 2.5 million year period. So studying galaxies out to a few tens of millions of light years away actually is almost like studying galaxies as they exist right in this moment. So if we want to understand how galaxies are existing roughly at today's time period, we can go out and observe galaxies roughly at the distance of Andromeda. And what we find is today, what we see is that galaxies are generally slowing down in their star formation. So how galaxies produce stars, they take gas, collapse it down under the weight of gravity, and then produce new stars. And what we find is that many more stars were formed in the past relative to how many stars are being formed today by these galaxies. Their star formation rate is slowing down. They tend to be redder than galaxies that we see at larger distances away, likely because new stars are not being formed, and these galaxies around our time are dominated by older, redder stars. And they also tend to be more massive than galaxies in the past. Okay, so I kind of had this argument that if you had a galaxy roughly at the distance of tens of millions of light years away, it gives you some insight into what galaxies are doing today. But if we really want to understand the history of galaxy formation in the universe, where these galaxies come from and how they evolve over time, you need to look back much, much further into space and time. So to do that, we use extremely powerful telescopes, which allow us to see the really dim light that's traveled from galaxies that's billions of light years away from us. That's dimmed quite a bit in its time reaching our telescopes today. So in particular, the James Webb Space Telescope is the new shiny tool in town that we use. It's something like a $10 billion telescope that's been put into space, whose job is to observe these faraway galaxies, to give us some insight into how galaxies form and evolve over time. So this image actually contains one of the oldest galaxies that's ever been observed by people. It was just taken a few months ago by this James Webb Space Telescope. And it's a little difficult to see given the field of light that you kind of see before you, but I can just point it out. It's this galaxy right here, the rather unremarkable looking red smudge in the corner there. And the way that we determine this is we actually look at what's called the spectrum of this galaxy. And by breaking the light from this little smudge into its component colors or component wavelengths, you can identify some really impressive key features about this galaxy. In particular, you can find its distance or its age. So by analyzing these spikes, what we found is this galaxy is something like, the light from this galaxy has been traveling for something like 13.1 billion years. So it's almost as old as the universe itself, which has an age of something like 13.8 billion years. Comparing it to galaxies that we see today, its composition is much different. It has many fewer metals, given that there haven't been as many generations of stars to produce those elements. And its star formation rate is much, much higher than what we see today. given the fact that there's lots of fresh material for these galaxies to use up to produce stars. So what's really interesting about this types of observation is that you're almost doing a sediment sample, I guess, a sediment core, to allude back to Maria's talk, in which you're picking out galaxies that exist at different distances away from you. And in that way, you can analyze the progression of these galaxies over time. You can actually watch these galaxies evolve by looking at their spectra at different distances. Now, there is one slight issue with this technique, and it actually doesn't take you back all the way to the very beginning of the universe. So what I'm showing here is a theoretical picture, theoretical timeline of the universe. So off to the left, we have the very beginning of the universe, which was something like 13.8 billion years ago. And off to the right, we have today. So this is where we sit, the Andromeda Galaxy sits, and most of the other galaxies that we see today. Our general picture of how galaxies formed is you start off with lots of fresh hydrogen and helium in the early universe. That hydrogen and helium then collapses to form stars in galaxies and black holes that become the more mature galaxies that we see today. The James Webb Space Telescope observes galaxies out to roughly this boundary right here. Once you reach that boundary, there's almost too much hydrogen and helium to observe further back in the history of the universe. You can almost think of this as like a fog that's surrounding these galaxies. It's actually absorbing some of the light that's coming from them. So at a certain point, there's so much hydrogen that surrounds these galaxies that it becomes nearly impossible to observe them, no matter how big a telescope you construct. So while James Webb will look deeper into the history of the universe to find some of these early galaxies, it will never see some of the very first galaxies that exist in our universe. And it especially won't see some of the smaller galaxies that aren't as bright as the ones that it's detecting today. And in particular, this is an area that we really want to understand better, because this gives us some insight into what the first stars, galaxies, and black holes were doing at the very, very beginning. And I like to liken this to how like understanding the development of like a toddler to an adult. The techniques we use now give us some insight into studying the universe as if it were, say, an adult. But if we want to understand these galaxies as they were as, like, say, teenagers or toddlers, the best we can do is kind of extrapolate from these older galaxies back to as they were billions of years ago. Okay, so I will skip forward a little bit. This, like I said, just gives us some indication of what's happening with these first stars and galaxies, given the observations that James Webb has done. But it's difficult for us to really understand what the first stars and galaxies are like just with James Webb observations. Okay, so what do we think is actually happening during this time period? Well, the best we can do at this point is simulations. So I'm going to show you a quick simulation of what we think is happening in the early universe. So what we're doing here is taking a cube of space, some cubic volume, and we are evolving it forward in time, allowing galaxies to form. And what we're seeing is these yellow dots are the galaxies that are forming in this cube. The black is that neutral hydrogen that's sitting between these galaxies, blocking the light that's coming from them. And what happens over time is, as these galaxies form and evolve, they eat away at that neutral hydrogen. They produce lots of high energy radiation, which actually burns it away, allowing us to more easily observe those galaxies. But we'd like to look back further in this simulation and understand what those very first stars and galaxies are doing. So we need a slightly different technique to do that. And I'll just kind of cut to the chase. The way we do this is not by studying galaxies themselves, but actually looking at the gas that's been sitting between these galaxies that makes it difficult for us to actually observe them. So this black neutral hydrogen, as it is in the simulation, actually provides own signature with which we can use to understand what these first galaxies and stars are doing. And it's incredibly sensitive to when these galaxies and stars form, what their temperature is, what types of radiation they're putting out. So if we had a way to get at that signal, then we could understand exactly when these first stars and galaxies form. Yeah, and the way we do that is by looking at hydrogen and looking for its emission, which happens in the radial. Okay, and how do we actually get at the signal? Well, we use extremely large radio telescopes. So this is the project that I alluded to at the beginning that I've been working on for the past couple of years. It's called the Hydrogen Epoch of Reionization Array. It's this massive 350 element radio telescope of 14-meter dishes that helps us get at this 21 centimeter signal, the signal from this hydrogen. And essentially the idea is you can use emission from this hydrogen at different frequencies to map out a three-dimensional volume of this hydrogen signal. You can actually watch it evolve. You can watch these new galaxies eat away at that signal. As more galaxies form, they will produce this high energy radiation, which will eat away at that signal, which we can detect using our telescopes. And the way we're doing this, we're looking at lots of these different frequency channels. It's almost like a tomographic scanning of the universe at this time. And hopefully when it's completed, it will give us some insight into when these first stars, galaxies, and black holes actually came into existence, and complete this picture for us of how these stars and galaxies formed and what they were like at the very beginning. And just to quickly wrap up, this effort to construct this array has been going on for several years now. It's a combined effort of hundreds of people, engineers, undergrads, graduate students, postdocs, and professors. The array is finally completed. COVID put some delays on the completion of the array, but we're actually taking data now and hope in the next couple of years to have enough to get at the signal and actually map out this hydrogen and provide some information about what the first stars and galaxies are doing in the universe. Okay, so just to quickly summarize, the finite speed of light allows us to explore the universe like a time machine. We can actually go back and look at those very first galaxies by observing that distant light. By using these standard techniques of using optical telescopes, we can get an understanding of how the galaxies evolve over time, but it doesn't give us a complete picture of the formation. So we need new techniques like these radio telescopes which will help us map out the universe and help us better understand those stars and galaxies. So I will end right there, and I can take any questions.
All right. Thank you, Tyler. I have some questions as usual, and I will lay them upon you, but I just want to see if there's a raised hand. Remember, if you do want to ask a question, you're taking a chance. Let me read it if you'd like, type it in the chat, or of course, raise your virtual hand there using the reactions button, and then let me acknowledge you, and then make your webcam active and unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. All right, Tyler, here we go. I have a question just about the image you showed recently of the Hera telescope. I guess it's Hera telescopes, right? Or is the whole thing referred to as Hera?
The whole thing is referred to as Hera, yeah.
It's about how many individual scopes?
350 individual telescopes. They're 14 meters in size. I didn't give a great sizing, but here are some people who work on site, the site crew, compared to each one of these elements. So it's a massive array. If you've ever seen Arecibo, it's about the same collecting area as Arecibo.
Oh, Arecibo is this single big dish built into although it's now dismantled, I guess, Arecibo scope is in a valley in Puerto Rico. Wow. Sierra Campagna asks where these telescopes are.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I mentioned we were looking in the radio band. If you notice, the frequencies that we're looking at are between roughly 50 megahertz and 250 megahertz. So right in the middle of our band is the FM radio, which is the radio that we get from our cars. It's roughly the frequency band also that some satellites transmit at. So to get away from at least the terrestrial sources of radio emission, we have to go to South Africa. So primarily when we do these experiments, you're either in South Africa or Western Australia, hundreds of miles away from any major city. So this particular site is something like a 7-hour drive from Cape Town. So it takes like 20-hour flight and a 7-hour drive just to get to site. So it's quite the trip to get there.
Wow. Have you been there?
I have not yet. No, I because I came in during COVID, so we weren't really sending people to site at that time, but I'm hoping in the next year I'll get to go.
Oh, cool. Jim Stauffer has a question. Jim, please unmute yourself and ask away.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Cox, for really lucid explanation there. The early universe presumably had just as much matter in it as it has now. So being in a smaller space, does the effect on light, the speed of light, complicate your calculations?
Oh, that's a good question. So are you asking if the speed of light relative to the size affects our?
Yeah, does it move slower in the early universe?
Oh no, so that's kind of the beauty of the speed of light, is it actually remains the same speed no matter what. For whatever reason in our universe, it's just kind of a quirk, I guess. There's this cosmic speed limit, and the speed of light always in a vacuum exists at that speed. Yeah, so we don't actually have to worry about any variable speed of light or anything like that.
Sorry, did I interrupt you, Tyler?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Just say, as a physics teacher, I want to point out that this apparently absolute fact about the speed of light being a speed limit in the universe is not like in the early days of supersonic travel, people thinking at first that we'd never go faster than the speed of sound. That was an aeronautical engineering challenge. Going faster than the speed of light is a theological challenge. We have so much evidence that the speed of light is the same everywhere and shall not be exceeded. Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. Thank you for the question, Jim. Niti, a great wondernaut who in fact will be transforming tonight's presentation into a video at the Wonderfest Science YouTube channel. Niti has a question. Fire away, Niti.
Hey, Tucker. Hey, Tyler. I had actually two questions. The first one was about star clusters. I mean, I know we're talking about galaxies, but I was just kind of like curious if star clusters are also kind of formed in a similar fashion as the galaxies, or is that part of your study, or, like just wondering how different, the two celestial objects are.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it's a complicated question because we actually are not quite sure how the first stars formed. And the reason for that is because we think you need heavy elements to cool these clouds efficiently to cause these stars to collapse and form. But we think they likely formed in a similar way. We think small clouds probably collapsed, fragmented, and then formed the first stars, and then those large clouds came together to form the first galaxies. So it was a hierarchical process is what it's called. Yeah, so we think they did form around that time, but we're not 100% sure about how they actually did or when they did. So we're still working on that as well.
All right. No, thanks so much. And I just have one other question. I think you did bring up James Webb Telescope a couple of slides back, so I just thought to kind of like ask something about that. I did read recently that I think the oldest galaxy discovered, probably this one, it is bigger, and it doesn't match like what was kind of expected. I mean, I read that it's bigger and it seems to be like more like newer, and it has more metals and more stars formed than what was expected. Is that correct?
Yeah,
I mean, that was one of the I don't know, like that was one of the things that I read online, where I was just like wondering if that's.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's a great question. I was wondering if anyone was going to ask this, because this was actually resolved yesterday. It was really funny. Yeah, this is how fast this field moves. It was posted on Twitter first, and the paper was posted just today on the archive. So the issue is, yes, they found a galaxy at redshift 16 or something, which is incredibly far away, and it was much bigger than any of our galactic models had predicted a galaxy should be at that time, or how many metals should be in the galaxy at that time. It turned out that our estimation of its distance was incorrect. So these first pass estimates take images of these galaxies, and they're like coarse images at just a few frequencies. And there are issues sometimes estimating the distances to those galaxies if you just have a few coarse frequencies. So what James Webb does is it follows up with a spectrum. So something like this, which has much more frequent sampling of the spectrum. And then it's much easier to tell what the actual distance of the galaxy is using that. So we confirmed it was something like a redshift 5 versus a redshift 16. So no problems anymore with our galactic models.
I see. Okay. Okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Niti. All right, let me read a question here from Mitchell Diamond. Does a galaxy that is around 13 billion light years away, as the one shown there circled in white in your current image that's up, does a galaxy like that correspond in any way to being near the edge or even outside of the universe?
That's a good question. It actually does not in this case. It just so happens to correspond to something that is whose light left its source about 13.1 billion years ago. So there are likely galaxies outside of our observable universe. This one just so happens to be at its position in the universe such that the light took 13.1 billion years to get to us. So yeah, no preferred like edge of the universe, and it's hard to say actually if there is any edge.
Mitchell, thank you for your question. Let me ask you, Tyler, the image that you've got there looks like a tiny smudge, of course, but I note that it is red. Can that in any way be attributed, even in part, to the red shift that very fast moving galaxies that far away would exhibit?
Yes, yeah, I was actually, I didn't want to get too much into the redshift discussion
Sure.
since I was already over on my slides. But yeah, it likely is due to the actual redshift of the object. So the expansion of the universe, which reddens these objects.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. We've had a couple of great presentations here. I want to thank everyone for being here and to remind you that our next Wonderfest and Berkeley Public Library collaboration happens on Wednesday evening, April 5th, right here on Zoom. It's Ask a Science Envoy, Earthquake Warning, and Genetic Engineering. Check it out at wonderfest.org. And I end tonight by offering 3 big thank yous. First, to you, Wondernauts and friends of the Berkeley Public Library. Second, to Wonderfest supporters and patrons. Thanks for pushing your coins our way. It really does help to keep Wonderfest alive. And third, and most important, thank you to our Wonderfest Science Envoys, Maria Viteri and Tyler Cox. Let's give them at least an American Sign Language silent applause. All right. Thank you, Jim, for making yourself visible to do that, and others. All right. Good night, all. Hope to see you in a week or so. And thanks again to Maria and Tyler. Bye-bye.